Hey friends, so please forgive the production quality here. Understand, I'm not a content creator. I'm really just tired of trying to type out explanations of this constantly, so I figured a video to reference back to would be helpful. So what I want to look at today is hyperkalemia, how that disturbs cardiac conduction, and then look at how calcium can potentially correct it, and maybe dive into why we have electrophysiology studies that support this strongly, but then we have a recent batch of in vivo studies which show that it doesn't really work in real life. So we'll look at a little bit about why that may be, and let's just cage this with, I am not a physician. I am not telling you to change your practice at all. I'm just a person with weaponized autism and an internet connection. So here we go. Quick review. This should be pretty basic to you, and if it's not, this might not be the video for you, no judgment. But in the cardiac cell, we maintain our resting membrane potential by the balance of ions inside and outside the cell, as well as the differential permeability to those. So we know mostly sodium outside and mostly potassium inside. And then we know we get a little bit of either calcium or sodium into the cell, which causes a degree of depolarization. And then we hit this thing called the threshold potential, where we actually get the opening of all of these sodium channels. The sodium floods in, and this changes our potential up to a just positive one. Let's put 0 about there. Okay? And we'll get up to maybe plus 30. Then in the cardiac cell, we have the opening of calcium channels, which leads to this plateau effect, and then we come back down. This is not the most perfect drawing. Don't worry about it. All right. Now, what happens when we introduce too much potassium outside of the cell? So now we've added positive charges out here relative to this. It's also changed the concentration gradient of these potassium ions, because now there's potassium outside the cell as well. So these electrical effects are actually going to be pretty minor in light of how many other sodium cations we have out here. But this change in the concentration gradient is going to mean that potassium shifts out more slowly, and that's going to cause this resting membrane potential here to climb. So our resting potential is going to come up here. And so instead of this, we're going to kind of come up, do our thing, and then come back down just to here. All right. No big deal. Why does this mess things up? In and of itself, this shouldn't do too much other than it will make it slightly easier to trigger an action potential. This could cause some small degrees of ectopy, but the most prominent features of severe hyperkalemia that we're worried about is the widening of the QRS and the delayed conduction, because having this difference in conduction pathways, and this should be review as well for you if you're watching this, but if you have fast travel this way and slower travel one way, and this tissue recovers faster than this tissue, eventually you can get a re-entry current. We're not going to get too much into the weeds on that, but you can get a cycle of current where it's just cycling, and this is how we end up with ventricular tachycardias, fibrillations, all the nasty arrhythmias. That should be review. Okay. What happens with the QRS and conduction in this hyperkalemic scenario, though, is actually due to these sodium channels here. So we're going to look at those guys up here and how they function. So your sodium channel actually has 3 states. This may be somewhat familiar to you if we're talking about like how lidocaine or other sodium channel blocking drugs and their use dependence works. But if that's all Greek to you, don't worry about it. We'll run through things here. So your sodium channels can be either closed and ready, open, so sodium can flow through, or they can be what we call inactivated. All right, and this is a special intermediate state. So they go through a cycle where they are closed, they get stimulated, they open, and then they have to go through this inactivated state before they can return to their fully rested and prepared state. Okay. The nuance of how this happens and why things get messed up is that your sodium channels open right here. So they go to this open state. Your potential bounces up, and then they come back to this inactivated state very quickly. This is to stop too much sodium coming in. It's much faster than the actual conformational changes that would have to happen to close this channel. Lots of good reasons this happens physiologically. Once it gets to this state, though, this membrane potential has to drop back down before it can return to, before it can return to the regular rested state. How quickly it returns to this regular rested state depends on how low this voltage goes and the amount of time. So it's an area under the curve thing. So if we have a resting membrane potential that is higher now, we have a reduced chance of these channels returning to their proper state. So we have more channels that are continuing to exist in this inactivated state as the resting membrane potential creeps higher. The reason this causes conduction issues now is, imagine, so we know that our action potential propagates as one channel opens, lets more sodium in, opens the next channel, so forth down the chain. But let's say this one's still inactivated, this one's still inactivated, and this one's still inactivated. You will still get an action potential. However, we've now greatly increased the distance that these sodium ions have to diffuse before they're going to create a localized change in the membrane potential enough to trigger the next sodium channel. So we get delayed propagation. And what this looks like in the ECG is when we have our QRS get wider as it's taking longer for that signal to propagate. Now, we know hyperkalemia also has some T-wave changes. I'm not going to get into that today. That needs a little more review of ECGs and how they work. Not the point today. How calcium is supposed to fix this is calcium actually has an important role modulating the recovery of these sodium channels. So inside of your cell, there's this helper we'll call calmodulin, CAM, okay? And then this binds with calcium, and this acts as a second messenger inside the cell for lots of purposes. But in the case of the sodium channels, this calcium calmodulin complex binds here onto this gate and kind of over here. And what it does is it helps to pry this guy back open. You could think about it that way in terms of the actual geometry of what's happening, is it helps to pry this guy open at a higher voltage than it normally would happen. So why calcium fixes all of these problems, in theory, is because now, even though our resting membrane potential is higher, we're also recovering these channels at a higher potential, say up here. And so we get more of them coming back online, we get normalization of this conduction. This is well substantiated, and actually this practice comes to us from studies on dog hearts, and where they take a little ventricular wedge preparation and they keep that alive in a petri dish and they do tests on it. They run a solution through it to keep that tissue kind of alive and to make sure that we have certain concentrations of all of these that mimics what happens inside the body. However, there's been a recent study. So the first one is this meta-analysis here by Jessen et al., okay, which looked at all the interventions around hyperkalemia, and it kind of came back saying that there doesn't actually seem to be much evidence that calcium does anything, and the way that we give it very frequently during cardiac arrest without definitive hyperkalemia may actually cause harm. Now, there is also a study in here, which I'll show you the original study. I'm just going to call this one the Turkish study because I don't want to butcher anybody's last names. But this one looked at ECG changes and how calcium affected those. So this is the only study that they could find doing the meta-analysis, which actually looked at ECG changes related to hyperkalemia and what calcium in particular would do for those. The other studies with calcium and cardiac arrest and stuff are more outcome oriented, but this is the one that specifically looks at ECGs. Now, this study showed that some rhythms did respond to calcium, but it was only minor, not clinically relevant ones. Some of these big bad things, like this QRS widening, this was exhibited by many patients in the study. I could give you the exact numbers, but anyway, that didn't respond. It was more minor things like first-degree heart blocks and stuff like that resolved. This study was also found by the meta-analysis to have a high risk of bias. And what I think that comes down to is the fact that in their treatment protocol, they were also giving simultaneously insulin and salbutamol while they were giving the calcium and while they were recording these ECGs over a period of about an hour. And what they did to make sure these ECG changes were related to high potassium is they checked if the ECG changes had resolved once they had fixed the potassium. The problem is that they're also giving these drugs at the same time, which we know definitively lower the blood potassium level, the insulin and the salbutamol, which is also well substantiated in the meta-analysis there. So it's not clear whether these changes in these minor rhythms is due to the fact that that potassium is actually trending down this entire time that you're recording the ECGs and giving the calcium. So it's a huge confounder that they didn't control for. Anyways, the point is, this may not actually work in real humans. And one of the other issues that I've come to identify is, again, because of these solutions that they use to perfuse these ventricular wedges, they will use something like a Tyrode solution with like 4 millimolar concentration of calcium. Okay. The problem here is that in this Tyrode solution, what we don't have is we don't have albumin, we don't have hemoglobin. These two guys here actually bind a lot of calcium, and that's why we have in our labs, you'll see like you have your total calcium or your ionized calcium. And the ionized calcium is going to be the one that's more electrically active in these messaging systems, right? And for an ionized calcium, so all of this is going to be ionized because there's none of these proteins. An ionized calcium of 4 millimolar is like fatal. You can't reproduce this in a human. Even if you could, let's go back to the sodium channels here. So these sodium channels are modulated by calcium through this calcium calmodulin complex, okay? However, this is happening on the inside of the cell. All these gates are hanging out here inside of the cell. And then inside of the cell, so we know we do have calcium channels. We've got 2 different types of them, but we have calcium channels that allow calcium in. However, this is just a tiny trickle, and most of the increase in intracellular calcium during the cardiac cycle comes from the activation of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So you got that bad boy over here. Not a good artist here, whatever. And you have your RYR receptors, ryanodine receptors, okay? These guys get triggered. These guys dump tons and tons and tons of calcium into the cell. Now, theoretically, you could have an increase in this amount of stimulation here from more extracellular calcium. You could have slightly more calcium entering the cell from these calcium channels. And there is a degree of compartmentalization around what's happening, and I don't know enough about the specifics of that to comment. Would love to hear from somebody who does. But that said, this is happening inside the cell, so a minor increase in the extracellular calcium concentration, in my opinion, is unlikely to actually result in a significant change in the intracellular calcium concentration during the point of the cardiac conduction cycle where this needs to happen. Now, even if this bump in extracellular calcium did improve this, Actually, let me back up. So from the electrophysiology studies, so we have these ventricular wedge preparations. There are also patch clamp recordings they do where they basically stick electrodes in cells, and these cells are also disembodied and are also existing in these artificial solutions, and depending on the setup, sometimes don't even include these other cellular components like the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So for those reasons, calcium doesn't seem to really work in real life, at least with the evidence that we have so far. We definitely need more studies to establish whether this does work, whether we need to have a higher dosage to make it happen, and or what the safety of that higher dosage is, given that we're kind of approaching some very dangerous territory with what's happened in these experiments that we're predicating this treatment on. So what I've realized from all this is calcium is kind of like, it's got the same evidentiary basis that we have for like 1 milligram of epinephrine Q3 to 5 minutes in cardiac arrest. You know, it comes out of dog studies in the 60s, which we've overgeneralized very confidently, but now it's become standard of practice, and we can't even do the studies to confirm whether it actually works the way that we think it does. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Peace out.